Hey y'all, welcome back to Made It Out to the Polls, our voter education series in collaboration with LPAC. Matilda and I flew to Minnesota after attending the DNC to sit down with Erin Maye Quade, who's a Minnesota state senator and a reproductive justice advocate. And we talked about why IVF is at risk today, as well as other forms of reproductive health care and freedoms. To explain the difference between IUI and IVF, here are the hosts of Staying Up podcast, Cammie and Taryn, podcasting.
Since my wife and I here are big old lesbians, we can't just make babies the old-fashioned way.
But that doesn't mean we can't make them at all. It just means that we must turn to science to help us using conception methods like IUI and IVF.
Let's start with IUI. IUI is more hotly known as intrauterine insemination, and it's the less invasive method of the two, where sperm is collected, then inserted directly into the uterus near the time of ovulation. Think turkey baster, with the hopes of making an embryo that grows into a cutie little baby.
IVF, in vitro fertilization, is a more involved process that we know all too well because we're currently going through it.
Aww.
During IVF, doctors help you stimulate your ovaries with shots, typically for 8 to 14 days, to produce as many eggs as possible. When you're fully cooked, your eggs are retrieved from the ovaries, then fertilized with donor sperm in the lab to create embryos. Over the next 5-ish days, those embryos go through several stages of growth before one gets picked to be transferred back into the uterus to make that cute little baby.
And there you have it. Wish us luck and let us get back to baby making.
All right. Thank you for being
Yeah,
here.
I'm glad to be here.
You have done so much incredible work with reproductive freedom, but I want to hear about your personal journey with IUI and how it played such a role to you and your wife starting a family.
Yeah, I mean, it was the whole way we were able to have our family. So we went through the IUI process, and it was, I mean, I got pregnant on the first try. I'm very lucky about that. And even then it took I want to say 8 months to go through. You know, you have the appointments and you have the sperm testing and oh my goodness, there's a fly.
Oh no.
The sperm testing and you have to have dye go through your, fallopian tubes, which is a really very painful process. And they test your levels. And I had to go on little amounts of hormones because my doctor was like, I just want some of these numbers to be slightly different. And there's progesterone and there's a lot that's involved in IUI. And all they're doing at the end of that is they're just putting some semen into your uterus. That's it.
It's really like the same thing that you would do
at home, basically, just no man.
Right.
But all the prep up to it was really intense. And it's different than IVF, certainly. It's a lot more invasive and it's less expensive and it's less physically taxing, but it's still a whole process for sure.
We're so curious because Matilda and I we've started kind of inching our way there.
Yeah.
We're getting older, so we're talking about freezing eggs and all this stuff. And we're using a known donor. From what I understand, there's still a lot of hoops you have to go through, even with a known donor. Because we thought, it'll be so much easier. But can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, the laws in each state are a little bit different. And so that is also a little bit of the calculus too. Like in Minnesota, when my wife and I were starting our family, we had to go through second parent adoption. So my wife had to adopt her own daughter. I've since changed the law.
Love
thankfully.
that. Wow.
So the two people who are, married and have a child are the parents upon the birth of that child in Minnesota. But, you have to, I would suggest doing a known donor contract that, really stipulates the relationship or lack thereof, that terminates parental rights, so on and so forth. And, we just had a case in Minnesota actually where it was a lesbian couple. They used a known donor. They thought everyone was super clear on what roles people were playing. And then when their daughter was 2 or 3, the donor was like, I'm the father, and had been telling people that he was the father. And he was in the life of the child, certainly as a friend of the couple. And so went to court to try to assert parental rights. And it went, pretty far into the legal process before the court was like, no, you are a donor. That was the agreement. But that legal, ambiguity was really terrifying for a lot of LGBTQ couples. And so donor contracts, I think, are really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I want to get into what's happening in Alabama. Are you able to kind of break that case down and explain?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say about Alabama, it is a notoriously anti-abortion state. They have written into their state constitution language around, when quote unquote life begins, which is, religiously motivated language, right? But what happened in Alabama is there was a couple who had frozen embryos. So there had been a retrieval, fertilization, and then storage of embryos. And I believe somebody dropped some of those embryos or dropped the container, and it resulted in the loss of those embryos. And so the couple sued the company that was storing it, and which I think all of those facts are pretty normal. What ended up happening is through the legal process or through the court process, there was this assertion that the damages that should go to the couple for losing the embryos should be on par with loss of life of a child, right? So if you had negligence in, I don't know, a carnival ride, right, and your child died, there would be damages that could be awarded for this loss. And through that process, the Alabama Supreme Court eventually ruled that embryos are quote unquote extrauterine children, and it had far-reaching consequences far beyond that specific case, right? They could have still awarded damages to that family, acknowledging the loss of the embryo was akin to losing, a child or a future child. But what they ended up doing was essentially saying that embryos are treated in law like children, and that put a huge legal risk on any provider who was participating in IVF with their patients. And so it stopped IVF in Alabama for a while. And I know that the legislature passed a law trying to clarify the two, but you can't really have a Supreme Court ruling saying this thing, that embryos are essentially children, and then not have that have implications for the providers who are providing reproductive health care and infertility treatments. And so it has really thrown the status of IVF and infertility treatments into flux in Alabama. And then certainly, there's concerns across the country because this is kind of the next place the anti-abortion movement has been going for a while.
So I want to just make sure we understand that the reason why IVF stopped was not because there was a ban on IVF. It was because that the providers were essentially scared to provide the care.
I mean, yes, in that, the way that a lot of laws happen is it's not we're banning abortion, it's we're criminalizing the people who would provide it, right? So that's how a lot of laws related to reproductive health care, the criminalization of pregnancy outcomes works, is that it's not necessarily writing into law it's illegal for you to have a miscarriage, but if you write it into law that anybody who's bleeding during a pregnancy is suspect, then it criminalizes the outcomes of pregnancy. And in a similar way, when you place that kind of legal liability on a doctor, that the way that they handle embryos is de facto the way that they handle children. What happens if there's, multiple embryos implanted and then they want to sue you? The legal risk is so heightened that it becomes a really terrifying place. And then there's concerns about not just the people who are transporting the embryos, but the people who are pregnant themselves, right? Let's say you have IVF, you have an embryo or two implanted, and then you go to a volleyball game and you get hit in the stomach and you don't get pregnant. Can you prove that that's why you didn't get pregnant? Did you damage that? It's a really terrifying place when we're talking about criminalizing pregnancy outcomes, because it criminalizes the behavior of pregnant people and everybody who works with them.
I want to understand more how this could become a nationwide problem. What are the steps? How could we get to where this could really affect all of us, not just Alabama?
Yeah. So, I think the United States Supreme Court is, has enough people who share the ideology of people like the Alabama Supreme Court or, just the anti-abortion movement in general. Amy Coney Barrett comes from a lengthy career working with extreme anti-abortion folks. She is probably the best person they could have on the Supreme Court if you were looking to criminalize pregnancy outcomes, ban abortion, ban IVF. So I think the way that this could come national is through something like a Supreme Court case, right? Similar to Alabama, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be about banning IVF or even putting more controls in place. It could be something like what we saw, which is making the argument that embryos have some sort of, the government has some sort of say over your family making, including your embryos, how many you create, where you store them, how many are transferred, how you create them. So like there are genetic tests that people do to screen out cystic fibrosis, right? Because it can be a lethal disease for people as they age, to say you can't do that anymore, right? There can be these kinds of controls.
So basically doing the genetic testing, no matter the outcome,
Correct.
you would still have to have the child.
Or that you couldn't do the genetic testing at all. I mean, the anti-abortion movement doesn't want people to create embryos. That is the goal, is because they would like to, essentially what they want is for man and a woman to have sex and only have sex for the purpose of making babies. So like the Heritage Foundation, which spearheaded Project 2025, they really want to ban sex for pleasure. They only want people to have sex, man and woman, to have children, right? And so like that is the ultimate goal, is to have like those kinds of families with those kinds of children. It plays into all sorts of different things about virality and like the kinds of families people should have. And there's a lot of religion and white supremacy washed up into it too. But your original question was how this could go national. And I think the Supreme Court is probably the most likely way that it would go national. Although I can see some states starting to it's really unpopular to ban IVF, right? So there's like sideways ways that they would do it. Like saying, you can only do like a fresh retrieval and implantation. So like you have a retrieval day, you can take out one egg and you can fertilize it and then, transfer it back in, but you can't take multiple eggs. You can't fertilize multiple embryos. An egg retrieval is incredibly arduous on a person's body. I mean, it is months of literally daily injections. There's like a trigger shot that you have to get with a very deep needle, either in your leg or in your butt. It's a surgery to retrieve the egg. I would say people who go through a lot of infertility treatments, like to the point where it's almost breaking them, 3 egg retrievals would be a lot.
Wow.
But people go through many transfers. They can, right? They could go through 3, 5, I know some people who've done like 7 transfers. And so imagine every time you do a transfer of an embryo and you would have to do a retrieval, it would essentially like limit the number of times people could try IVF. So that is one way that I could see that happening through laws and or the courts, is not allowing people to create embryos, just having it be, egg retrieval, fertilization, and make embryo transfer back in.
It's so insidious.
I know. It's a lot of involvement in people's personal decisions in their lives.
And why? Why do they care?
Well, it's not about babies. It's about women. That's the primary thing. It is about their view of women and their role in society and in family life. It's very tied up, like the trad wife movement, right? Which has its roots in Nazism. Like, I should be really clear about that. It's not like this cute thing that started online as a Nazi meme that kind of made its way into online content. Like, the goal of the anti-abortion movement is to control people's intimate life decisions. Who you have sex with, when you have sex, why you have sex, how you build your family, who you're married to, like what books you read, what medications you take. Like, that is the whole point. And that's how it'll go nationwide. And it'll happen in a lot of different ways, right? Some through state legislatures, some through school boards, some through federal Congress, some through the United States Supreme Court. It just depends on like where the power levers are. And I think we look at Project 2025 as like a future plan, but it's one that's already in action and happening in a lot of different ways throughout the country. It's just not a coordinated federal effort with the power of the federal government with it yet.
Because you're saying it's already happening in
Yes.
states.
Absolutely. More than half the states have abortion bans of some level. We've banned gender affirming care in a whole bunch of states, right? They're banning books. They're throwing out like whole, subject areas of degrees in Florida colleges and, on and on and on, right? They're definitely already doing Project 2025 in lots of different ways throughout the country. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So speaking of gender affirming care,
Yeah.
Can you explain what is happening with these laws that they're trying to pass? Or that are passing?
Yeah, yes. So the first thing I'll say is that after the, religious right lost on marriage equality, after Obergefell legalized marriage equality throughout the country in 2015, the year I got married, they kind of regrouped to be like, okay, what is our next galvanizing issue, right? And so I'll quote the guy who was the spearhead of the anti-trans kids campaign. He said, "We threw everything at the wall, and the thing that stuck was trans kids."
Oh my God.
So that is where it comes from. It is, again, an organizing issue for voters to scare them, to incite fear and distrust and othering. But it is also part of a nationwide and worldwide campaign to peel back support for the LGBTQ community more broadly, right? It's like, okay, well, we couldn't go after gay people successfully, so let's start with trans people. And once we start chipping away calling trans people pedophiles, we can just get better at calling gay people it's to like really roll back the support that LGB people have nationwide and the rights we have nationwide. Also, the right wing, they test their strategies on kids first, right? So they'll ban abortion for minors, and then they'll ban abortion for everybody. They'll ban gender-affirming care for minors, and then they'll ban gender-affirming care for everybody. And really what I would say, I work at a gender equity organization that works across, trans and LGB and repro, and then what you would call like traditional feminist issues, because it's all gender, right? It's all based in gender. Which is why I'm qualified to speak about this. Mm-hmm. But the anti-abortion playbook is the anti-trans playbook. It's the same one. They're just happening asynchronously. So they're just, 50 years behind in the anti-trans playbook, but it's the same one. So
meaning they're using all the same tactics,
absolutely,
all the same strategies.
Yes, yeah. I can tell them all to you if you want.
Patterns.
Yes, patterns. It's, substituting science for religion. So on the anti-abortion side, life begins at conception. On the anti-trans side, there are only two genders. There's the kind of storifying anecdotal people who have regret narratives, right? So people who do regret having abortions, which is few and far between. And then there's, people who regret transitioning, right? As if the government's job is to legislate away opportunities for people to have regret in their life. The kids part, right? So you start with kids. Anti-abortion folks started with, banning access to abortion for minors. Now they're doing that with gender-affirming care. I should also say that gender-affirming care for minors, it's for trans minors, because puberty blockers and the healthcare and all that, that's still available to cis kids. It's just not available to trans kids. Most kids who access gender-affirming surgeries are cis girls who are 16 and 17 that are getting breast augmentations, right? Like gender-affirming care happens for cis people too. They're just targeting trans kids. So they haven't outlawed the procedures and the, medications. They've just made it illegal for trans kids to get it, not cis kids, right?
I just want to understand, why would a puberty blocker be taken
by a cis kid?
Yes.
Precocious puberty is the most common one.
Okay.
So, some kids start going through puberty. One of the reasons for the decline in mental health in young people, not all of the reason, but one of them is the early onset of puberty. Like it's starting younger and younger, and it's a lot for a developing brain to handle, right? Mm-hmm. Socially, internally, like if you're 8 and you're getting your period, like that's really incongruent. Mm-hmm. And so puberty blockers are used for precocious puberty. Kids who are, I have a friend who's like 6'2". She took puberty blockers for a few years because she was growing way too fast. And they were like, we got to slow down. It's painful. And she's real tall. And there are cis boys that have gynecomastia. So they'll develop breast tissue and they'll have, top surgery as cis boys when they're in middle school or high school, right? Like these medications are used, by cis kids all the time, and cis adults, right? There are cis women who take hormone replacement therapy. There are cis men who take hormone replacement therapy. People get filler and Botox and makeup and dye their hair and, get hair transplants and all of that.
Yeah.
It's all gender affirming care. They're just banning it for trans kids than people, not cis kids than people. So
how can we stop it? How can people, a better question is, how can people join the fight? People who aren't in politics and aren't out there every day making this their job.
Yeah.
How can we get involved?
There's so many ways. So I want to start with like the lowest barrier to entry, which is engaging in hard conversations in our day-to-day life and understanding we don't need to know more in order to do that. So I'll give you a really good example. I was talking to a mom who's the head of the PTO in her kids' school, and she knows that it's bad the way some people talk about trans kids, but she doesn't know what to say. And she thought it was because she needed to understand more about what it was like to have a trans kid, or like what healthcare they were getting, or like why, or at what point. And I was like, you don't need to understand all of that. Like, we don't talk shit about kids. Yeah. And she was like, right. So like understanding that we actually don't talk about kids' bodies. It's really inappropriate. We don't ask really personal and intimate questions about their healthcare to their parents because it's none of our business. Mm-hmm. And so we don't need to know more information to know that the best thing for a kid is a loving family who works with them throughout their whole life for them to be who they are, whatever that means. And that we don't need to know more to not talk shit about kids or their families, whether they're trans or not. And I think once we kind of take ourselves out of the mentality of like, I have to have more information, then you just go back to your base level of like, how do we operate with human beings? And that is where we can start to speak up. So really good phrases are like, oh, I'm actually not a safe person to talk to about that, right? Like, or I'm not a person you want to say that to. I'm not sure why you thought you could say that to me. I don't like that. Or, I'm not a person you can say that to, right? Like those are really good phrases. Or, I just don't think that matters to you or me that much. Like, let's stay out of it. I'm thinking a lot about parents who have kids who play sports, and there might be trans kids who play sports. Like kids play sports for team building and fun and to like get outside and to exercise, right? We don't need to be knowing what's in a kid's pants in order for them to like enjoy the benefits of a t-ball team, right? Yeah. Beyond just like the everyday conversations, you can get involved with it depends on the issue, but you can get involved with like a gender equity organization like Gender Justice where I work. You can get involved with a local candidate. I mean, right now, it is not exclusive, but it's pretty polarized in terms of support for LGBTQ people and repro rights between the two parties. It shouldn't be that way. It hasn't historically been that way. There are a lot of older established reproductive rights groups for women that include Republicans and Democrats. It's just become less and less common as the parties calcify. But so, you could look at party identification, I guess is the best way for me to say that. You could assume that your Democratic candidate probably supports some form of reproductive rights. And you could probably assume that your Republican candidate does not, unless they've said otherwise, right? Mm-hmm. That would be a good piece to note. Who endorses them is also a good place to note. On LGBTQ rights, it's a little different because it depends on the topic. So here in Minnesota, we had Republicans vote to ban conversion therapy, but it was pretty party line when we made Minnesota a trans refuge state, right?
Trans refuge state? What exactly does that mean? Here's queer sex therapist Casey Tanner making a drink to explain.
A trans refuge state is a state or territory where transgender individuals are legally protected and have access to the resources and support they need to thrive, such as Massachusetts or California. These states often have laws that protect transgender people from discrimination in areas like housing, employment, and public accommodations.
So it depends on the topic and what you're talking about. But again, asking a candidate, reaching out, looking at their website, looking at who endorses them, that's all going to tell you a lot. And I think asking, like, go to your forums and town halls for your state legislators and your school board candidates and your county commissioners. Ask that question, like, do you support LGBTQ rights? Do you think people, you can ask people that, and you should be able to get a pretty straightforward answer, if somewhat uncomfortable, because sometimes straight people have a hard time like talking about supporting gay people, even though in their hearts and their votes they do, but they like don't know how to say it without sounding weird, but that's okay.
They clam
We
up.
love them. Yeah. Or sometimes they're like, it doesn't matter who's in your bed. I'm like, yeah, but it's more than that, but okay. We love you. Yeah.
I know we've touched on this a little bit, but I want to be explicitly clear in how this upcoming presidential election could affect the rights, reproductive rights, and the rights of LGBTQ people.
Yeah. The thing I'll be really clear about saying is that the anti-abortion movement has worked for a very, very long time to ban abortion nationwide. They are almost there. The only thing that they need is a Republican anti-abortion president. They don't even need Congress to do it, because we have an old law called the Comstock Act, which prohibits the mailing of things that are used in abortion services. So medication abortion, or literally any of the equipment that an OB-GYN would have in their office to assist in miscarriage management or abortion care. So that is how they could ban abortion without needing to pass one single law, because the federal president enforces the law. And it's just been an unenforced law since, for a really long time. So that is how it could happen.
Wow.
So that is what folks need to know about abortion bans. And like, there wouldn't need to be a critical mass of people in Congress to do it. We just need one president to do it. The other thing to know too is that much like Donald Trump appointing 3 justices that eventually led to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, there are going to be more retirements from the Supreme Court in the next president's term, right? And so there have been, this past Supreme Court term was one of the most consequential in the negative for our multiple generations, right? Like, we're not talking just mine and my daughters, but probably my daughter's kids as well, unless we have some court reform or some weird things happen with the composition of the court. And they're not all immediately felt, like Roe v. Wade being overturned, when a bunch of states had trigger bans that went into effect where all of a sudden you couldn't access abortion care. It is going to be a slow drip, drip, drip. When I was in high school, I graduated high school in 2004, there was an assault weapons ban. It expired in 2003. And then in 2008, there was a Supreme Court decision that established an individual right to own guns. So think about from 2008 to today, the increase in mass shootings, right? It's a drip, drip, drip. It's not always immediately felt. So folks need to know that, you know, voting is not a love letter. It's not a Valentine. It's a chess move, right? It's a strategic vote. It's a, you know, tacky V, if you will, a tactical vote. And that we organize ourselves into governing coalitions in the United States before elections instead of after. So we do have multiple parties in this country. We just organize into governing coalitions before we vote instead of after. And so look at your governing coalition. Like, look at the people who make up the Democratic Party. There are multiple coalitions in that. And look at the folks who make up the Republican Party. And there are multiple coalitions in that too. Many of those coalitions are absolutely dedicated to decimating the rights of trans and LGBT people and women and people with uteri.
Wow. Thank you for spelling that out.
Wait, can I add one more thing?
Yes, please do.
If people have decided and they're going to vote for Kamala Harris, here's what I want you to do. Wherever you live, vote early. And the reason why is because once you vote, you get taken off the list of people that the party in your area needs to reach out to convince to vote. So if you vote early, you're like, they don't have to spend resources on you. So if you already know that you're voting for Kamala Harris and, you know, whatever state, what state are you in?
We're in California.
You're in California. Well, I want to go on the swing states. You're in Wisconsin and you know that you're voting for Kamala Harris. You know you're voting for Tammy Baldwin, and you know you're voting for the Democratic members, Mark Pocan, let's say he's in Madison, for Congress. Like, go and vote the first day of early voting. Like, just get it out of the way, because one is that election day is just one day and you never know what's going to happen on a random Tuesday, right? You just don't. So get it out of the way. But two, it really helps alleviate resources to get out to people that we actually need to convince to go vote. Yeah. So that is like a huge thing, that people who already know they're voting and they already know who they're voting for, get it done on the first day you possibly can.
Wow, that is incredible.
Yeah.
So in closing, as you know, this is a series in collaboration with LPAC.
Yeah.
And can you just speak a little bit about the importance of organizations like LPAC and what a donation to them can do?
I mean, I think it's, you know, the organizations that support candidates like myself are few and far between, right? You get issue-based organizations all the time, but very rarely there aren't as many organizations that support you in the unique way of your identity. And so a donation to LPAC supports queer candidates across the country in places that you might not think of. I mean, I'm sure everybody was thinking about Apple Valley, Minnesota when they, you know, think about LPAC and they think about, you know, their donations. But I was a, you know, queer Black young woman who flipped a seat in 2016. I was the only Democrat to flip a seat from Republican to Democrat, and in part because of LPAC's support. Wow. And there's so much more to a candidate than money, but money to them, it comes to us in different ways too. So it's, you know, there's lots of parts of a campaign, like your website and your staff and your script and your, you know, there's so many parts to it. And especially when you run for the first time, you're like, what are we doing here? Yeah. And so organizations set up to support candidates in that way, it changes everything.
Where can people find you and how can they get involved with your campaign and your mission?
You can find me at Erin, Erin Maye, Maye Quade, Quade, literally everywhere. It's my website. It's all my handles. You can find me. You should donate. I would love to be done fundraising before 2026. So come on and donate.
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Made it out of fundraising.
Yes.
We do one last thing.
Yeah.
We play a game.
Okay.
It's called You Haul or You Ghost. It's kind of like a red flag, green flag thing.
Yeah.
So she's perfect in every way. Okay. Except for she's a big Green Bay Packers fan.
Oh God. Oh, I'm so sorry, but I would you ghost.
You would ghost.
I like Skol. Okay. Fuck the Packers. I love you, Wisconsin, but fuck the Packers. God, she's perfect in every way except she's a Packer fan.
Yeah.
I mean, I would probably haul it, but I would give her shit about it every single day.
She never lived it
She would literally never, like, she might have to switch, right? My legislative assistant is a Packers fan, and I bring it up, like, every time she's like, Ayana's amazing. I'm like, yeah, but she's a Packers fan. Like, it's a thing for me.
Oh, thank
That's a good
you
question.
so much
Yeah.
for sharing and for being here. I really appreciate you.
Yeah.
This series is a collaboration between Made It Out Media and LPAC. This episode was produced by Matilde Jordan, Jacqueline Taboni, and Michelle Atwood. This episode was edited by Matilde Jordan with cameos edited by Amber Rivera. Thank you to all of our cameo guests, Cammie and Taryn Arnold Scott, and Casey Tanner. Tune in next Tuesday, October 8th for my conversation with Lauren Ashley Simmons on religion's role in policy and the anti-LGBTQ agenda.
Reproductive rights. People deserve the freedom to make their own decisions.